Welcome everyone to part 2 of my review of Shenmue. If you missed part 1, go ahead and click on the link below or the annotation within the video. And I went in part 1 into a more personal journey into my experience with the game over the years, and part 2, I'm now going to go over a more traditional review of the game. Shenmue wastes no time in throwing you into the story. The opening sequence shows Ryo Hazuki arriving home to find a gang of men in black suits, along with the menacing Lan Di beating up and interrogating his father, looking for a mysterious mirror. They obtain the mirror and kill Ryo's father. Haunted by nightmares and the sight of his father's death, Ryo is compelled to solve the mystery of who those men were, what was that mirror they were after, and how were they connected to his father's past. Driven by a blinding desire for revenge, Ryo seeks answers and struggles with the notion that his path of vengeance could mean leaving his life behind. Does giving up his education, his love, and possibly his future honor his father's memory, or is Ryo's quest more self-serving and juvenile in its short-sightedness? Part of the brilliance of Shenmue is that each player comes to their own conclusion and perceives the path of Shenmue's story differently. This is primarily due to the game's pacing. The real meat of the story, the scenes and events that everyone experiences no matter how different their path to said plot point it was, is actually rather short, and does little to move beyond a well-written and well-paced kung fu flick from the 80s. The best aspects of Shenmue's story are what is fluid, rather than what is solidly laid out to form a path from the dramatic opening to the ending. In many ways, Shenmue is actually closer to a 3D iteration of old 2D DOS-era point-and-click adventures than to a typical action RPG. Its pacing is slow and anything but deliberate, unless the player is solely goal-oriented. You spend most of your time wandering around the game's 3 main areas and later the docks, starting in Disc 2, talking to people and gathering clues to progress the main story. If you're quick-witted and can memorize the layouts of these areas early on, most of these early stages of the game can be breezed through rather quickly, but those who follow this pattern may begin to wonder what the big deal is about Shenmue. The problem is that so many games today have taught players to move from point A to point B as quickly as possible, whereas Shenmue wants the player to slow down. In a way, Shenmue dares you to be bored. The excellence of Shenmue is in the mundane. Shenmue's core consists of walking, talking, getting a job, and waiting around for events to occur, while occasionally getting into a fight or a brief QuickTime event, something that, in many ways, Shenmue, for better or worse, invented. To some, this sounds slow and boring, and highlights a fault that is only a fault in the player's perception. Players who aren't detail-oriented, who only want constant action and flash, will probably dislike Shenmue. And part of that might lie in the expectation of the player, as the majority of negative reviews I've seen come from those expecting a more action-oriented experience, or those who simply didn't understand or are unwilling to examine the purpose behind the game's structure and pacing. Many games are paced much like a movie in which only the events the player experiences are those of note, the highlights of the story, while leaving out the mundane aspects in between them. Shenmue takes the opposite approach and lays out the entire experience for the player to explore. Ryo needs to talk to someone at the barbershop down the street for the next clue, but the shop is closed by the time you get to it. You need to wait until the shop opens. Ryo plans to meet someone tomorrow afternoon. Well, you might have to find something to do until then if there's no more questioning to do around the town. Ryo doesn't have enough money to do the next step. You have to find a way to earn that money, primarily by getting a job that you actually have to work. It's at these times that Shenmue is at its best. Shenmue gives you time to play around, to explore its world, and that world is more alive than most. Populated by a staggering number of well-developed side characters and a realistic world that follows daily schedules, Shenmue isn't about being told a story, or even playing in a story, but living the daily life of a character within a set story. You can help raise a stray cat, buy and drink sodas from vending machines, spend money on building a giant capsule toy collection. There are shops with various items to buy, contests to win, and even games you can play on Ryo's Sega Saturn at home. There's even a fully functioning arcade with actual real-world playable arcade games and a jukebox.
One game, 100 yen.
Come on!
100 yen. Guess I'll try it.
You quickly become involved in the daily lives of everyone who lives in Ryo's hometown. What makes this experience so personal is that how you experience this world is entirely up to the player. There are multiple ways to learn the same information and get to the same points, and numerous small storylines can be entirely missed if you don't take the time to know certain people. How you relate to Shenmue's world can change the way you perceive its overall story, and even make you look at some of the main characters, like Ryo's girlfriend Nozomi, with a better understanding of her perspective by understanding the world she lives in. Of course, the game isn't entirely about those slow moments. It's full of action-packed fights and reflex-testing quick-time events where you have to rapidly press the corresponding buttons that flash on screen.
相手してる暇はない。俺に構うな。
そうはいかねえぜ。やりやがったな。なんてやつだ。
Like the overall structure of its world, Shenmue's combat and character progression take on a more realistic approach. You won't build experience points and gain levels to make Ryo stronger. Instead, you will slowly learn new moves to make Ryo a more capable fighter. You can practice these moves in a vacant area in town or in the dojo at your home. The more you practice special moves, the stronger they become. In this fashion, Ryo becomes stronger not by arbitrary numbers or leveling, but due to diligence. He becomes more skilled as the player him or herself becomes more skilled. The rising difficulty of fights is perfectly balanced against the actual skill of the player, better than most RPGs or action games of this type. The moves themselves are also based in real martial arts and are never over the top or incredibly flashy. Damage done to opponents and the damage Ryo receives also seem to have a more realistic effect rather than relying on arbitrary life bars based on levels. The fighting system is complex and fun, as it is based on the Virtua Fighter system and will feel familiar to fans of that series. Outside of fights, Ryo can walk or run around, drive a forklift for work, and even participate in forklift races that are a lot more fun than they sound. The only issue with the gameplay comes from the Dreamcast controller itself in a way. The controller only has one analog stick, and Yu Suzuki decided to make the analog stick the look function and to utilize the D-pad for moving Ryo around. This can make Ryo's movement a little clunky, although it is actually perfect during combat sequences where you would prefer a D-pad for that style of Virtua Fighter fighting. In a way though, it's very telling regarding Yu's focus on the importance of looking at the world around you above physically moving through it with any precision. Besides, after a while you get used to it, and in the moments where you would actually need precise movements to continue, you're engaged in a QuickTime event. Also, this less than perfect control over Ryo's movements forces the player to slow down and look around. You also have constant access to Ryo's journal in which he jots down new information, as well as phone numbers and other pertinent information. This is particularly helpful in guiding the player, helping to recall important information or even plan ahead. The numbers themselves bring up another interesting factor in Shenmue. You can turn light switches on and off, open practically every drawer or closet in Ryo's home, and actually pick up and examine individual objects. There are countless small, seemingly meaningless details throughout Shenmue's environments that could be easily missed. All of this serves to further the sensation of living in a real, functioning place. Even more impressive is that each area is based on a real-life location, and Yu Suzuki and his team went so far as to accurately depict the daily weather from those locations on the dates in Shenmue in the 1980s.
In Shenmue, everything continually changes, just as in real life. Depending on how the player progresses in the game, each event will be an unique experience to each player. One player may experience an event in the rain. Another player may experience the same event in the snow. And another may even experience it under strong sunlight. Players who took their time in a quest may arrive at the next town in a whole different climate. This new system, which enabled the high level of freedom and reality, is magic weather. The change of time and the change of weather which comes with it is expressed real time. The same places will not always look the same.
There's only one flaw that I can point out in this vast attention to detail, that, while minor in the grand scheme of things, always stuck out to me. With this borderline absurd attention to detail, especially at the time of its release, and the fact that Ryo can purchase and consume drinks, why wasn't eating included? Ryo can buy snacks, Tom's hot dog wagon is right there, not to mention a burger joint, an Italian restaurant, and numerous other places to eat. It always stuck out to me as a missed opportunity that was highlighted even more for me when I started playing the Yakuza series, which includes eating at various restaurants and stands throughout the games. The opportunity to eat is always around you, and there's great attention to detail inside at these actual restaurants. And the drinking animation, if you think about it, is halfway to an even kind of clunky, half-done eating animation. It may not bother most people, and is honestly a nitpick on my part, but it seems like a rather peculiar thing to leave out, given this intense level of detail.
Good.
Everything about Shenmue's visuals are outstanding. For a game that came out 16 years ago at the time of this review, it holds up surprisingly well, and even supports the Dreamcast VGA box if you happen to have one of those. Coupled with the Dreamcast's stupendous video quality, Shenmue not only looks significantly better than its contemporaries, but it would have looked right at home even several years later. Its music is also extraordinary and really gives you the feeling that you're in 1980s Japan, while also hinting at a much grander adventure to come. There's an almost mystical quality to much of the soundtrack. There's only one remaining minor flaw with the presentation, and one very decisive sound issue. The only visual flaw for me was the common occurrence of pop-up of characters in town. This didn't always occur, and never detracts from the experience whatsoever, but it can be noticeable and really needs to be pointed out, as it is really the only visual flaw. Then we come to the voice acting. The original Japanese voice acting was superb, but the English dub sounds like it came straight out of a late 70s or early 80s low-budget kung fu flick. Shenmue, while it does have many lighthearted moments, has a serious and emotional story that the English dub detracts from.
Oyaji!
来るなリオ。
もう一度尋ねる。鏡はどこだ？
答える気はない。
Ma'am, I found it.
Did you? Thank you so very much.
This is it.
Thank you for taking the time to help me, young man.
らっしゃい、奥どうぞ。
いえ、食事じゃなくて。
なんで違うのかい。ならすいませんが、ちょいと忙しいんでお帰りいただけやすか。
わかりました。じゃあ失礼します。
That being said, I'm strangely glad it exists. Given the time period and location of Shenmue and the story itself, it actually lends itself well to a nostalgic 80s kung fu flick bad dub, and gives the game some more character and creates some memorable comedic moments. Where would we be without quoting Ryo looking for sailors? I really wish there was an option to switch between the English and Japanese dub, as the original voices were a lot better. While Shenmue's story and main characters are great, its visual and musical presentation is grand, and it displays a technical marvel well ahead of its time, it's the little things between and behind these amazing points that move the game from fantastic to a timeless masterpiece. The game does have a few minor flaws, but nothing that keeps it from being a true masterpiece that everyone should at least try. Shenmue is the beginning to a much bigger story. Shenmue, while fantastic, isn't able to escape from the feeling like it is the first act in a much larger story. However, this isn't a flaw, as that's exactly what it is, and it's more than good enough to stand on its own. Shenmue is a wonderful experience that hints at even grander things to come.